So, I made some tea. I've got my book, and I'm going to read to you. Tonight I'm going to read The Plague by Albert Camus. And yeah, it's reversed. Luckily, it's the right way from where I'm sitting. This book was one of the first books I read that was related to medical history. It's one of my favorite books. He was a sort of an existentialist weirdo. But this book is written as if it was a documentary. It's, of course, originally in French. I don't speak French. I don't think most of you do, so I'm going to be reading it, the English translation. And I think it came out in the 40s, like the late 40s, this book. So we're going to start with part 1 of The Plague by Albert Camus. Part 1. The unusual events described in this chronicle occurred in 1940-something at Oran. Everyone agreed that considering their somewhat extraordinary character, they were very out of place there. For its ordinariness is what strikes one first about the town of Oran, which is merely a large French port on the Algerian coast, headquarters of the prefect of a French department. The town itself, let us admit, is ugly. It has a smug, placid air, and you need time to discover what it is that makes it different from so many business centers in other parts of the world. How to conjure up a picture, for instance, of a town without pigeons, without any trees or gardens, and where you never hear the beat of wings or the rustle of leaves. A thoroughly negative place, in short. The seasons are discriminated only in the sky. All that tells you of spring's coming is the feel of the air, the baskets of flowers brought in from the suburbs by peddlers. It's a spring that's cried in the marketplace. During the summer, the sun bakes the houses bone dry, sprinkles the walls with gray dust, and you have no option but to survive those days of fire indoors behind closed shutters. In autumn, on the other hand, we have deluges of mud. Only winter really brings pleasant weather. Hang on, my dog. Come here. Come here. He's very angry. He does not like this book. Hey, shh, shh, we're reading. Thank you. Yes, he's an asthma chihuahua. Perhaps the easiest way of making a town's acquaintance is to ascertain how the people in it work, how they love, and how they die. In our little town, all three are done on much the same lines, with the same feverish yet casual air. The truth is that everyone is bored and devotes himself to cultivating habits. Our citizens work hard, but only with the object of getting rich. Their chief interest is commerce, and their chief aim in life is, as they call it, quote, doing business. Naturally, they don't eschew such simple pleasures as love-making, sea-bathing, or going to the pictures. But very sensibly, they reserve these pastimes only for Saturday afternoons and Sunday, and employ the rest of the week in making money, as much as possible. In the evening, when leaving the office, they gather at an hour that never varies, in the cafes, the boulevard, or they take the air on their balcony. The passions of the young are violent and short-lived. The vices of older men seldom range beyond an addiction to bowling, banquets, and socials, or clubs where large sums change hands on the fall of a card. It will be said, no doubt, that these habits aren't peculiar to our town. Really, all our contemporaries are much the same. Certainly nothing is commoner nowadays than to see people working from morning till night and then going to fritter away at card tables, cafes, and in small talk, what little time is left for living. Nevertheless, there still exist towns and countries where people have now and then an inkling of something different. In general, it doesn't change their lives. Still, they have had an intimation, and that's so much to the good. Oran, however, seems to be a town without any intimation. In other words, completely modern. Hence, I see no need to dwell on the manner of loving in our town. The men and women consume one another rapidly in what is called the act of love, or else they settle down to a mild habit of conjugality. We seldom find a mean between these two extremes. That, too, is not exceptional. At Oran, as elsewhere, for lack of time and thinking, people have to love one another without knowing much about it. What is more exceptional in our town is the difficulty one may experience there in dying. Let me look at these. Hi, everybody. Holy shit. What is more exceptional in our town is the difficulty one may experience there in dying. Difficulty is perhaps not the right word. Discomfort would come nearer. Being ill is never agreeable, but there are towns that stand by you, so to speak, when you're sick, where you can, after a fashion, let yourself go. An invalid needs small attentions. He likes to have something to rely on, and that's natural enough. But at Oran, the violent extremes of temperature, the needs of business, unending business, the uninspiring surroundings, the sudden nightfall, and the very nature of its pleasures call for only good health. An invalid feels out of place there. Think of what it must be like for a dying man, trapped behind hundreds of walls sizzling with heat, while the entire population, sitting in cafes, hanging on telephones, is discussing shipments, bills of ladings, discounts, and deals. It will then be obvious what discomfort attends a death, even a modern death, when it waylays you under such conditions in such a dry place. These haphazard observations give a fair idea of what the town is like. However, we must not exaggerate. Really, all we wanted to convey was the banality of the town's appearance and of life in it. But you can get through the days there without trouble, once you have formed habits. And since habits are precisely what our town encourages, all is for the best. Viewed from this angle, its life is not particularly exciting, that must be admitted. But at least social unrest is unknown among us, and our frank-spoken, amiable, and industrious citizens have always inspired a reasonable esteem in visitors. Without trees, without glamour, and without souls, the town of Oran ends by seeming restful, and after a while you can go complacently to sleep there. It is fair to add that Oran is grafted onto a unique landscape, the center of a bare plateau, ringed with luminous hills and above a perfectly shaped bay. All that we regret is the town being so disposed that it has purposely, architecturally, turned its back on the bay, with the result that it's nearly impossible to see the ocean. You must always go search for a look at it. This is the normal life of Oran, so it is easily understood that our citizens had not the faintest reason to apprehend the incidents which took place in the spring of the year in question, and which were premonitory signs of the grave events we are about to chronicle. To some, these events seem quite natural, to others incredible. But obviously, a narrator cannot take account of these differences of outlook. The business is only to say this is what happened. And when we know it actually did happen, that it affected the life of an entire populace, and that there are thousands of eyewitnesses who can appraise in their hearts the truth of what is written. In any case, the narrator would have little claim to competence for a task like this, if chance had not put me in the way of gathering much information, and had he not been, by the force of things, closely involved in all that he proposes to narrate. This is the justification to play the part of historian. Naturally, a historian, even an amateur, always has data, personal or second-hand, to guide him. The present narrator has three kinds of data. First, what he saw himself. Secondly, the accounts of all other eyewitnesses. Thanks to the part he played, he was able to learn their personal impressions from all those in this chronicle. And lastly, documents that subsequently came into his hands. He proposes to draw on these records whenever this seems desirable and employ them as he thinks best. And the time has come to drop preliminaries and cautionary remarks, and to launch into the narrative proper. The account of the first days of the plague needs giving in some detail. I'm going to pause. I'm going to wave to everybody. That's the first section of part 1. I'm going to keep going as soon as I take a sip of tea. Don't leave me. Don't leave me. Chai. Part 1, Section 2. While leaving his surgery on the morning of April 16th, Dr. Bernard Rieu felt something soft under his foot. It was a dead rat lying in the middle of the landing. On the spur of the moment, he kicked it to one side, and without giving a further thought, he continued on his way downstairs. Only when he was stepping into the street did it occur to him that a dead rat had no business on his landing. So he turned back to ask the concierge of the building to see to its removal. It was not until he noticed Michel's reaction to the news that he realized the peculiar nature of his discovery. Personally, he had thought the present of the dead rat odd, but no more. The concierge, however, was genuinely outraged. On one point, he was categorical. There weren't no rats here. In vain, the doctor assured him there was a rat, presumably dead, on the second-floor landing. Michel's conviction was not to be shaken. There weren't no rats in the building, he repeated, so someone must have brought this from outside. Some youngster trying to be funny, most likely. That evening, when Dr. Rieu was standing in the entrance, feeling for the latch key in his pocket before starting up the stairs to his apartment, he saw a big rat coming towards him from the dark end of the passage. It moved uncertainly, and its fur was soaking wet. The animal stopped and seemed to try to gain its balance, then moved forward again towards the doctor, halted, and spun around on itself with a squeal, falling to its side. Its mouth was open and blood spurted from it. After gazing at it for a moment, the doctor walked past and went upstairs. He wasn't thinking about the rat. The glimpse of spurting blood had switched his thoughts back to something that had been on his mind all day. His wife, who had been ill for a year now, was due to leave the next day for a sanatorium in the mountains. An aside, tuberculosis makes you cough blood. And at the time this was written, there were no treatments for tuberculosis. People who had it, the consumption, usually died of it. And sending people into better air, like mountain air, was kind of seen as a cure. So, the sanatorium. Back to the story. He found his wife lying down in the bedroom, resting, as he had asked her to do, in view of the journey before her. She gave him a smile. "Do you know," she said, "I'm feeling ever so much better." The doctor gazed down at the face that turned toward him in the glow of the bedside lamp. His wife was only 30, but the long illness had left its marks on her face. But the thought that came to his mind as he gazed at her was, how young she looks, almost like a little girl. But perhaps that was the smile which erased everything else. "Try to sleep," he counseled. "The nurse is coming at 11, you know, and you have to catch the midday train." He kissed her moist forehead, and the smile escorted him to the door. The next day, April 17th. At 8 o'clock, the concierge stopped the doctor as he was going out. "Scallywags," he said. "They've dumped 3 dead rats in the hall." They'd obviously been caught in traps with very strong springs, as they were bleeding profusely. The concierge lingered in the doorway for a while, holding the 3 rats by their legs, and keeping an eye on the passers-by, on the off chance that the miscreant would give themselves away by grinning or some facetious remark. His watch had been in vain. "I'll nab 'em all right," said Michel hopefully. Very puzzled, Dr. Rieu decided to begin his round in the outskirts of town, where his poor patients lived. The scavenging in these districts was done late in the morning, and as he drove his car along the straight and dusty streets, he cast glances at the garbage cans aligned along the side of the sidewalk. In one street alone, the doctor counted as many as 12 rats, deposited dead on the vegetable and other refuse in the cans. He came to his first patient, an asthma case of long standing in bed, in a room that served as both a dining room and bedroom and overlooked the street. The invalid was an old Spaniard with a hard and rugged face. On the coverlet in front of him were 2 pots containing dried peas. When the doctor entered, the old man was sitting up, bending his neck back, wheezing and gasping in an effort to catch his breath. His wife came in with a bowl of water. "Well, doctor," he said, while the injection was being made, "they're coming out. Have you noticed?" His wife explained with a sigh. "The rats, he means. The man next door found 3. They're coming out. You can see them in all the trash cans. It's hunger," the man replied. Ryu soon discovered that the rats were the only topic of conversation in that part of town. After this round of visits, he went home. "There's a telegram for you upstairs, sir," Michelle informed him. The doctor asked him if he had seen any more rats. "No," the concierge replied. "There ain't been any more. I'm keeping a sharp lookout, you know. Them youngsters won't dare when I'm here." The telegram informed Ryu that his mother would be arriving the next day. She was going to keep house for her son during his wife's absence. When the doctor entered his apartment, he found the nurse already there. He looked at his wife. She was in a tailor-made suit, and he noticed that she had applied rouge. He smiled at her. "You're looking very nice," he said. "It's splendid." A few minutes later, he was seeing her into the sleeping car. She glanced around the compartment. "Isn't it too expensive for us?" "It had to be done," Dr. Yu replied. "You must rest." What's this story about rats going around?" "I can't explain it, dear. It certainly is strange, but it will pass." He begged her to forgive him. He felt he should have looked after her better. He'd been remiss. She shook her head, as if to make him stop. He said, "Well, once you're back, everything will be better. We'll make a fresh start." "That's it," she said, with her eyes sparkling. "Let's make a fresh start." Then she turned her head and gazed through the car window at the people on the platform, jostling one another. The locomotive hissed. Gently he called his wife's first name, and when she looked around, he saw her face was wet with tears. "Don't," he said. Behind the tears, she smiled again. "Off you go," he said. "Everything will be all right." Oh. He took her in his arms, then stepped back to the platform. Now he could only see her smile through the window of the train. "Please, dear," he said, "take great care of yourself." But she couldn't hear him. As he was leaving the platform, near the exit he met Mr. Othon, the police magistrate, holding a small boy by the hand. The doctor asked him if he was leaving. Tall and dark, Othon had something of the air of what used to be called a man of the world, and something of an undertaker's assistant. "No," the magistrate replied. "I have come to meet Madame Othon, who's been to present her respects to my family." The engine whistled. "These rats now," the magistrate began. Dr. Ryu made a brief movement in the direction of the train, then turned back to the exit. "The rats," he said. "Oh, that's nothing." The only impression of that moment, later, which he could recall, was that as he turned, a railroad man with a box full of at least 50 dead rats passed by. Early in the afternoon of that day, when his consultations were beginning, a young man called on Dr. Ryu. The doctor gathered that he had come before in the morning and was a journalist by profession. His name was Raymond Rambert. Short and square-shouldered, with a determined-looking face and keen, intelligent eyes, he gave the impression of someone who could keep his end up in any circumstances. He wore sporty clothes and came straight to the point. His newspaper, one of the leading Paris dailies, had commissioned him to make a report on the living conditions prevailing among the Arab population, and especially on the sanitary conditions. Ryu replied that these conditions were not good, but before he would say any more, he wanted to know if the journalist would be allowed to tell the truth. "Certainly," Rambert replied. Dr. Ryu explained, "I mean, would you be allowed to publish an unqualified condemnation of the present state of things?" "Unqualified? Well, I couldn't go that far, but surely things aren't quite so bad as that." "No," Dr. Ryu said quietly, "not so bad as that." He had put the question to find out if Rambert could or couldn't state the facts without altering the truth. "I have no use for statements in which something is kept back or used for bad purposes, so I shall not furnish information in support of you." The journalist smiled. "You speak as if you're very just." Without raising his voice, Dr. Yu said, "I don't know anything about that." The language he used was that of a man who was sick and tired of the world he lived in, although he had much liking for his fellow men. But he had resolved to have no truck with injustice, bigotry, or compromises with the truth. His shoulders hunched, Rambert gazed at the doctor for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "I think I understand you," and got up from the chair. The doctor followed him to the door. "It's very good of you to take it like that," he said. "I understand," Rambert repeated, with a hint of impatience in his voice. "I'm sorry to have troubled you." While shaking hands, Dr. Ryu said, "If you're out for a curious story for your newspaper, you might say something about the extraordinary number of dead rats being found in town just now." "Aha!" Rambert exclaimed. "That does interest me." Later, on his way out at 5 for his second round, the doctor passed on the stairway a stocky young man with a furrowed face and bushy eyebrows. They had met once or twice in the top-floor apartment, which was occupied by male Spanish dancers. Puffing a cigarette, Jean Tarou was gazing down at the convulsions of a rat dying on the steps in front of him. He looked up, and his gray eyes fixed on the doctor for some moments. Then, after wishing him good day, he said, "It's rather odd, the way the rats were all coming out of their holes to die." "Very odd," Dr. Ryu agreed. "And it ends by getting on one's nerves." "In a way, Doctor, only in a way," Tarou said. "We've not seen anything of the sort before, that's all. I find it interesting, definitely interesting." He ran his fingers through his hair to brush it off his forehead, and looked again at the dead rat, and then smiled. "But really, Doctor, it's the concierge's headache, isn't it?" As it so happened, the concierge was the very next person Dr. Ryu encountered. He was leaning against the wall by the street door. He was looking tired, and his normally reddish face had lost its color. "I know," he said to Dr. Ryu, who was informing him of the latest casualty among the rats. "I keep finding them by 2s and 3s, but it's the same thing in every house." He seemed depressed and worried, and was scratching his neck absent-mindedly. Dr. Ryu asked him how he felt. The concierge would not go so far as to say he was feeling ill, but he was not quite up to the mark. In his opinion, it was due to worry. He said, "The damned rats have given me a shock, like. It would be a relief when they stopped coming out and dying all over the place." The next morning, April 18th, when the doctor was bringing back his mother from the station, he found Michel looking still more out of sorts. The stairway from the cellar to the attic was strewn with dead rats, over a dozen of them. The garbage cans of all of the houses in the street were full of dead rats. The doctor's mother took it quite calmly. "It's like that sometimes," she said vaguely. She was a small woman with silver hair and very gentle eyes. "I'm just glad to be here with you again, Bernard. The rats can't change that." He nodded. It was a fact that everything seemed easier when his mother was around. However, he rang the municipal office. He knew the man in charge of the department concerned with the extermination of vermin, and he asked him if he had heard about these rats dying in the open. Oh yes, Mercier knew all about it. In fact, 50 rats had been found in his own office, which was near the wharf. To tell the truth, he was perturbed. Did the doctor think it meant anything serious? Dr. Ryu could not give a definite opinion, but he thought the sanitary service should take action of some kind. Mercier agreed. "And if you think it's worth the trouble, I'll get an order issued as well." "It is worth the trouble," Dr. Ryu replied. The charwoman had just told him that several hundred dead rats had been collected in the big factory where her husband worked. At about this time, the townsfolk began to show signs of uneasiness. Because from April 18th onwards, massive quantities of dead or dying rats were being found in factories and warehouses. In some cases, the animals were killed simply to put an end to their misery. From the outer suburbs to the very center of the town, in every byway and alley where the doctor's duties took him, in every street, rats were piled in garbage cans or lying in long lines in the gutters. The evening paper that day took up the matter and inquired whether or not the city fathers were going to take steps and what emergency measures were contemplated to abate this disgusting nuisance. Actually, the municipality had not contemplated doing anything at all, but now a meeting was convened to discuss the situation. An order was transmitted to the sanitary service to collect the dead rats at daybreak every morning. When the rats were collected, 2 trucks would take them to be burned in the town incinerator. But the situation worsened in the following days. There were more and more dead vermin in the streets. The collectors had bigger truckloads every morning. On the 4th day, the rats began to come out and die in batches. From basements, cellars, and sewers, they emerged in long, wavering files and herds into the light of day, swaying helplessly, then did a sort of pirouette and fell dead at the feet of all the horrified onlookers. At night, in passages and alleys, their shrill little death cries could be clearly heard. In the morning, the bodies were found lining the gutters, each with a pile of blood next to it like a red flower on its muzzle. Some were bloated and starting to rot, others rigid with their whiskers erect and their legs sticking up. Even in the very center of the town, in the financial district, you found them piled in little heaps on landings and in backyards. Some crept forth alone to die singly in the halls of public offices, courthouses, playgrounds, and cafe terraces. The townsfolk were amazed to find such busy places as the Place d'Armes, the boulevard, and the promenade along the waterfront dotted with repulsive little corpses. After the daily cleanup of the town at sunrise, there was a brief respite. Then gradually, the rats began to appear again in numbers that went on increasing throughout the day. People out in the early evening would feel underfoot the squelchy roundness of still warm bodies. It was as if the earth on which our houses were built was being purged of its secret humors, thrusting to the surface the abscesses and pus clots that had been forming in its entrails. You must picture the consternation of this town, this very modern town, so tranquil, and now, out of the blue, shaken to its core, like a quite healthy man who all of a sudden feels his temperature shoot up and the blood like wildfire in his veins. Things went so far that the Ransdorf Information Bureau, which ran a free information talk on the radio by way of publicity, began its talk by announcing that no less than 6,231 rats had been collected and burned in a single day, April 25th. Giving as it did an ampler and more precise view of the scene daily enacted before our eyes, this amazing figure administered a jolt to the public nerves. Till now, people had merely grumbled at a stupid, obnoxious visitation. They now realized that this strange phenomenon, whose scope could not be measured and whose origins escaped detection, had something vaguely menacing about it. Only the old Spaniard with asthma, whom Dr. Rieu was treating, kept rubbing his hands and giggling. They're coming out, with senile glee. On April 28th, the Ransdorf Bureau announced 8,000 rats had been collected, and a wave of panic swept the town. There was a demand for drastic measures. The authorities were accused of being slack, and people who had houses on the coast spoke of moving there, even though it was early in the year. But next day, the Bureau informed them that the phenomenon had nearly abruptly ended, and the sanitary service had collected only a trifling number of rats, less than 50. And everyone began to breathe more freely. Things were back to normal. It was, however, on this day, at noon, on April 28th, that Dr. Rieu, while parking in front of his apartment house, noticed that the concierge coming toward him from the end of the street was dragging himself along, his head bent, his arms and legs splayed out, with the jerky movements of a clockwork doll. He was leaning on the arm of a priest who the doctor knew. It was Father Panlou, a learned and militant Jesuit, who he had met occasionally and who was very highly thought of in the town, even in circles indifferent to religion. Rieu waited for the two men to draw up to him. Michel, the concierge's eyes were fever bright, and he was breathing wheezily. The old man explained that he had felt a bit off color and had gone out to take the air, But as he walked, he had started feeling pain in all sorts of places, his neck, his armpits, and his groin, and had started to turn back. Panaloo had come along just in time to give him his arm. "They're just swollen," he said. "I must have strained myself." Leaning out of the window of the car, the doctor ran his hand over Michelle's neck. A hard lump, like a knot in a piece of wood, had formed there. "Go to bed at once," he said. "Take your temperature, and I'll come see you this afternoon." When the old man had gone inside, Ryu asked Father Panloo what he made of the queer business with the rats. "Oh, it's an epidemic they've been having, I think." The father's eyes smiled behind his big round glasses. After lunch, while Ryu was reading for the second time the telegram his wife had sent him from the sanatorium, the phone rang. It was one of his former patients, a clerk in the municipal office, ringing him up. He had suffered for a very long time from a constriction of the aorta, and as he was poor, Dr. Ryu had never charged him a fee. "I'm glad, doctor, that you remember me," he said, "but this time it's someone else. The man next door has had an accident. It's serious. You must come." He was out of breath. Dr. Ryu thought quickly. Yes, he could go see the concierge afterwards. He was entering a small house a few minutes later in the Rue Faubert, on the outskirts of town. Halfway up the drafty stairs, he saw Joseph Grand, the clerk, hurrying down to meet him. Here was a man of about 50 years of age, tall and drooping, with narrow shoulders, thin limbs, and a yellow mustache. "He seems better now," he told Dr. Ryu, "but I really thought his number was up." He blew his nose vigorously. On the top floor, Dr. Ryu noticed something scrawled in red chalk on the door to the left. "Come in. I've hanged myself." They entered the room. A rope dangled from a hanging lamp above a chair lying on its side. The dining room table was pushed into a corner, but the rope was empty. "I got him down just in time." Grand seemed always to have trouble finding his words. "I was going out, and I heard a noise. And when I saw that writing on the door, I thought it was a prank. But then I heard a groan, and it made my blood run cold." He scratched his head. "This seems like a painful way of doing it, I should think. So naturally I went in." Grand opened the door, and they were standing on the threshold of a bright but barely furnished bedroom. A plump little man was lying on a brass bedstead against one of the walls, breathing heavily. He gazed at them with bloodshot eyes. His face was very pale. Dr. Ryu stopped short. In the intervals of the man's breathing, he seemed to hear the little squeals of rats, but he couldn't see anything moving. So he went to the bedside. Evidently, the man had not fallen from a sufficient height, or very suddenly, for his collarbone had held. Naturally, there was some asphyxia. He would need an X-ray, he thought. Meanwhile, the doctor gave him a camphor injection and assured him he would be all right in a few days. "Thanks, Doc," the man mumbled. Ryu asked Grand if he had notified the police, but he hung his head. As a matter of fact, I haven't." "Quite so," Dr. Ryu said. "I'll see to it." But the invalid made a fearful gesture and sat up in bed. "I feel much better," he said. "It's not worth the trouble." "Don't be alarmed," Dr. Ryu said. "It's only a formality. I have to report this to the police." The man slumped back on the bed and started sobbing. Grand went up to the bed. "Come on, Monsieur Cottard. Try to understand. People would say the doctor was to blame if you took it into your head to try again." Cottard assured him fearfully that there was no risk of that. He'd had a crazy fit, but it was past, and all he wanted now was to be left alone. Dr. Ryu was writing a prescription. "Very well," he said. "I'll say nothing about it for the present, but I'll come and see you again in a few days. Do not do anything silly." On the landing, he told Grand that he was obliged to make a report, but would ask the police to wait for a few days before questioning him. "Someone should stay with this man tonight," he said. "Does he have relatives?" "I don't think so," said Grand, "but I can stay with him. I can't say I know him well, but one has to help a neighbor, doesn't one?" As he walked down the stairs, Dr. Ryu caught himself glancing into the dark corners, and he asked Grand if the rats had disappeared in his part of town. Grand, for his part, had no idea. It's true he'd heard gossip about the rats, but he never paid much attention to it. "I have other things to think about," he said. Dr. Ryu was in a hurry to get away and was already shaking his hand. He had to write a letter to his wife, but he wanted to see the concierge first. News vendors in the street were shouting the latest news, that the rats had disappeared. But Dr. Ryu found his patient, leaning over the edge of the bed, one hand pressed to his stomach and the other to his neck, vomiting pink bile into a slop pail. After retching for some minutes, the man lay back gasping. His temperature was 103. The ganglia in his neck and limbs were swollen, and 2 giant black patches were developing on his thighs. He now complained of pain in his guts. "It's like fire," he whimpered. "This bastard's burning me inside." He could hardly get the words through his lips, and he gazed at the doctor with bulging eyes that his headache had filled with tears. His wife cast a very anxious look at the doctor, who said nothing. "Doctor," she said, "what is it?" "It could be..." He paused. "It could be almost anything. Nothing definite yet. Give him plenty to drink." The sick man was complaining of a raging thirst. On returning to his apartment, Dr. Ryu called his colleague Richard, one of the leading doctors in the town. "No," he said, "I can't say I've noticed anything exceptional. No cases of fever with local inflammation? Oh, wait a minute. I have 2 cases with inflamed ganglia." "Abnormally inflamed?" "Well," Richard said, "that depends on what you mean by normal." At any rate, that night the porter was running a temperature of 104, in a delirium, and babbling about them rats. Dr. Ryu tried a fixation abscess. When he felt the sting of the turpentine, the old man yelled, "Those rat bastards!" His ganglia had become larger and felt like lumps of solid flesh embedded in him. His wife had completely broken down. "Stay with him and sit up with him," the doctor said, "and call me, if it's necessary." April 30th. The sky was blue and slightly misty. A warm, gentle breeze blew, bringing with it a smell of flowers from the suburbs. The morning noises of the streets sounded louder and gayer than usual, for everyone in the town this day brought the promise of a new lease on life, now that the shadow of fear, under which they had been living for a week, had lifted. Ryu, too, was in an optimistic mood when he went to see the concierge. He was cheered up by a letter from his wife that had come in the early mail. But Michelle's temperature had gone down to 99, and though he still looked very weak, he was smiling. "He's better, isn't he, doctor?" the wife said. "Well, it's a bit too early to say." And by noon, the man's temperature had shot up again, abruptly to 104. He was in constant delirium and had begun vomiting blood. The ganglia in his neck were painful to the touch, and the old man was straining to hold his head as far as possible from his body. His wife sat helpless at the foot of the bed, her hands gently clasping his feet. She stared at the doctor imploringly. "Listen," the doctor said, "we have to move him to a hospital. We have to try something. I'll ring for the ambulance." 2 hours later, they were in the ambulance bending over the sick man. Words came from his mouth, coated now with sores. He kept repeating, "Them damned rats! Them damned rats!" His face had gone livid, grayish-green, and his lips were bloodless, his breath in sudden gasps. His limbs, spread out by the ganglia, were embedded in the berth as if he were trying to bury himself in it, or as if a voice from the depths of the earth were summoning him below. The unhappy man seemed to be stifling under some unseen pressure, barely breathing. His wife sobbed. "Is there any hope left, doctor?" she said. "He's dead," said Ryu. And that's the end of Section 2, Part 1. So we've come through a town, very boring, normal, safe, modern, industrious, rich town, where everyone's a little bit of a comfy asshole, watching thousands of rats die in front of their faces, and finally we have just a concierge and one other person with bad symptoms. I'm going to stop this video for the night. I'm going to save it. I'm going to pop it up on YouTube and put a link. Maybe I'll put a link on my bio and then on Facebook. And tomorrow night at around 10 or 11, I'll pick up where we left off and we'll read a little bit more. We've gotten through the ominous part. Well, some of it. So I'll talk to you guys tomorrow.